You'd think that when it comes to video game sequels, it'd be an easy win, right? I mean, you've got an already established premise, characters, and mechanics. So all you really got to do from that point on is let things run their natural course. Maybe add in a few new features, update a few of the shortcomings, and try to take the player somewhere they've never been before. And a lot of the time, this works pretty well, with the sequel being as well received, if not better, than its predecessor, when devs are smart enough to know how to capitalize on this. We've seen it plenty of times with stuff like Half-Life 2, Uncharted 2, Galgun 2, and Street Fighter 2. However, every now and then, for whatever reason, it doesn't quite go that way, and the sequel ends up being worse off, or at least that's how people seem to perceive it. And today, I'm going to be taking a look at a few of the more notorious examples. Not necessarily the worst games ever made, but just the kind of thing that left people a bit dumbfounded, staring at their screens and wondering what the hell just happened. Starting firstly with what's probably the most objectively bad sequel of all time, and that's with Capcom's Devil May Cry 2.
Wonderful!
The follow-up to the original 2001 near masterpiece, and I think most people already know the backstory with this one, in that it was originally meant to be a Resident Evil game, though Capcom realised how batshit crazy the whole thing was and turned it into what we now know as Devil May Cry.
Block off, Featherface, or you can stick around and find out the hard way.
Even though it weirdly still retains a lot of elements we eventually see in RE4. Like the whole spooky castle premise, collecting items and backtracking, there's flying bug enemies in the sewers, there's the constant one-liners and wisecracks from the protagonist, with even some of the music sounding similar. Either way though, it wanted to become its own thing and is still easily one of the best games on the PS2. With it making perfect sense then that Capcom would capitalize on it with a sequel, which they did, with Devil May Cry 2 released in 2003, which is easily the worst game in the franchise. Bringing back Dante in an all-new story where he teams up with a woman named Lucia to stop an ancient demon from being resurrected by a guy who looks like the Wish.com version of Heihachi Mishima.
Liar!
And the weird thing is, despite this being pretty much panned, I do actually remember playing it back in the day when it first launched on the PS2. And although I never finished it, I do remember thinking that it wasn't that bad. At least, you know, not as bad as everyone else is making it out to be. However, coming back to it now at the ripe old age of 40, I can say that, yeah, it's pretty terrible.
What type of dog is this?
And the fact that I played through it after finishing the first game probably didn't help things either. The first thing that really stands out here is just how Dante comes across as this entirely different person. Barely ever talking or making any wisecracks during any of the cutscenes, and just having no real sense of personality.
Looks like it's your lucky day. Meanwhile,
I hope for your sake you got something inside that big body of yours.
Which might have been fine if he was the only one acting like this. Only that new character Lucia is also similarly behaved, being somewhat aloof and kinda distant. And that kind of thing only really works when one person's doing it. I mean, look at Clint Eastwood in the Dollars trilogy or Mad Max. Like, those guys might have only said a handful of words in the entire movie, but it was everyone else around them who was picking up the slack.
Bravo.
So when both the main characters literally don't communicate outside of short sentences, it doesn't come across as charismatic or intentional. Just kind of makes them look withdrawn and bored. Visually too, this one is far less impressive. When the first area in the game, for instance, is this village on some kind of made-up Mediterranean island, and just compare how this all looks to the dark and gothic castles we got in the first game. All those artistic and imposing structures with the sweeping camera angles and gorgeous architecture replaced with rows and rows of copy-pasted roof tiles, where it gets even more mundane later on when you get to some of these industrial-looking areas. And yes, like, I get that it's a video game from 2003, okay? I get it. But just on a basic artistic level, this thing is miles and miles behind the kind of stuff we got in DMC1. I don't know, it's just got no style or flair. I mean, where's the goddamn style and flair? Devil May Cry looks like a really nice piece of priceless antique furniture, kind of thing that gets handed down through generations. Whereas Devil May Cry 2, it looks like a plastic chair from IKEA. Not to mention the camera in this is just absolutely awful, frequently obscuring your vision and with enemies half the time not even being on the screen. which, to be fair, did happen a bit in the first entry, but nowhere near to this extent. Then you start getting into all the combat and you realise how shitty all of this stuff is as well, with all of the various combos and moves from the first game now being practically non-existent, and the enemies being far less threatening. I actually still remember playing DMC for the first time and really being shocked at just how much damage those marionettes did, not to mention how aggressive they were right from the first time you encountered them. These new enemies in DMC 2 though, they mostly just stand there in one place, barely offering up any real challenge. And in fact, I think I only died maybe once during my entire playthrough with both characters. Now this might have been fine if the combat system was fun to engage with, but even this feels like it's taken a couple of steps backwards. In DMC, for instance, you had Dante's Alastor and Ifrit weapons, which would massively change up the kind of attacks you did. Alastor gave you these faster attacks useful for small groups of enemies, as the sword could easily cleave through multiple opponents at once. And then the Devil Trigger would turn you into this winged demonic figure that could hover and fire out lightning bolts. Ifrit, on the other hand, gave you these slower but harder hitting attacks, allowing you to do these more powerful combos like roundhouse kicks and even throw meteors. All of which could shred through single enemies and really excel during the boss fights. In DMC 2 though, you've just got a couple of different swords for each character, none of which even really seem to differ all that much. And about all you can upgrade here is just the base damage they do. There's no fun nor creative moves to unlock here, and you can get through most of the game by just spamming the basic attacks over and over or holding down the fire button. And even when you're playing through the game as Lucia, it's more or less the same as Dante anyway. It's just that instead of using guns, she throws daggers. And for a fair chunk of the game, you can rely on the pistols or the daggers to do all the heavy lifting. In fact, I'm pretty sure there's certain enemies and bosses that you quite literally cannot damage without using ranged weapons. Like that infamous infested chopper, which is the most tedious fucking boss fight that has ever existed. Dragging on through like 4 separate phases and ending in this completely boring finale on a rooftop where half the time you can't even see it.
They really made a big mess, didn't they?
And speaking of the boss fights, these are just absolutely woeful, with some really lame encounters like these demonic tanks that just soak up an insane amount of damage, with there even being 3 of these you have to destroy in total. Or this stupid moth thing that keeps spawning in larvae that's going to quickly gobble you up if you don't jump away in time. None of which are just really all that fun or interesting to fight. But even just like the basic combat loop is really piss weak. And it's not helping either that the style meter is super hard to get going, simply because your combo ends within seconds if you're not attacking an enemy. And because the enemy count is so low, most of the time it is consistently hard to build this up, just making a shitty combat system feel even shittier. Which again, doesn't really change all that much regardless of who you're playing as.
Accepted.
Though at least in A Stroke of Mercy, Lucia's campaign is shorter than Dante. I mean, I think Dante's story might take like 6 or 7 hours to get through, whereas Lucia's takes about 3. I do want to say though that I don't think all of DMC 2 is bad. I mean, for instance, I do like how they added in the option to quickly swap ranged weapons without having to go back into the menu and do it all manually. Dodging is also a lot easier now too, simply because you can just press the circle button and do it without having to lock onto an enemy first. And speaking of that as well, you can now simply fire your weapons with a square button, removing that short delay as well. Some of the new acrobatic moves I also think look pretty cool, like all the wall running stuff where Dante or Lucia leap backwards and fire their weapons. And you got to admit that Lucia is a pretty awesome character visually, making it another one of Capcom's best blunders in that they just never brought her back for any other game.
I don't believe you.
I don't know, I like to think she's off hanging out with Sheva from RE5 somewhere, just waiting for the call.
My name is Sheva Alama.
But overall, it is quite astonishing just how much of a terrible sequel this thing is. Which starts to make a bit more sense when you learn that the people who worked on this had nothing to do with the first game. Having said that though, we do need to mention how the guy who directed this, Hideaki Itsuno, did go on to direct Devil May Cry 3, which is widely agreed upon to be the best in the series. And credit where credit is due, right? Like, this guy just didn't bail out with his tail between his legs. He made a decision to come back and try to right the wrongs, which most fans would agree I think he did, even then working on a lot of other games in the series. But that really might be the only redeeming factor this one has. And I'd argue that if no one told you what this was, you could almost be fooled into thinking it wasn't even part of the series to begin with. And speaking of sequels that seem to lose their identity, let's move on to the next game with Splinter Cell Conviction. The 5th entry in the long-running stealth series, and definitely one of its most notorious.
Gotta be him! Hey, shit!
I mean, you got a series of games here known for their slow, methodical approach to stealth, where it was all about patience, observation, and timing. And then now with this 5th entry, they went towards a faster, far more aggressive, action-oriented approach, where we played as a very different version of Sam Fisher. With the whole thing taking place after the bad ending to Double Agent, with Sam becoming a bit disillusioned after the death of his best friend and the supposed death of his daughter Sarah, going rogue as a result.
Give me a little credit, Sam. Don't tell me you don't recognize my voice even after all this time.
Brought back into the game, literally, by Grimm, to help her uncover this corruption within the agency.
Stop it. I need you to do this.
And then prevent this greater plot to kill the president, with Sam also killing countless people along the way. Which is really why so many people seem to dislike this, because for the first time in the series, we weren't playing as this super careful spy. We were now playing as this edgy action hero who just went around shooting everyone. I gotta be honest though, in that I do kinda like Conviction's take on Sam as a character. I mean, I think most people maybe overlook the fact that Sam has always been this highly trained and super effective agent. It's just that he's always been held back due to his orders from Third Echelon, which dictate to him the rules of engagement and all that kind of stuff. I mean, he's always been a killer, but only when the situation called for it, which meant he spent most of the time subduing his enemies when he needed to, as opposed to just mowing them all down in droves. And the idea here in Conviction is that you take that same character, with their wealth of experience and training, and then show them at a point where they think they've got nothing left to lose, and then let them off the leash.
Watch your back, he might...
Putting him in situations where the people that get in his way are just obstacles between him and his goals. And what does someone like Sam do when a mindless, nameless grunt gets in their way? Well, you'll see that firsthand. A lot.
Fuck me!
It's also definitely the most mobile we've ever seen Sam as well, at least in the speed that he's able to move, with the way that he can quickly leap up walls or grapple along ledges. You can pull people out of the windows and let them fall to their death, and shoot objects dangling on the ceiling to turn them into these makeshift traps.
Jesus Christ!
And it's almost kind of like you're playing as the Batman in the way that you hide in the shadows and can leap off higher ledges to take enemies out.
Bye-bye.
The thing is though, like, while the stealth is still based around being in the shadows, it's now been greatly simplified. There's a little prologue sequence that explains how staying in the dark hides you from the bad guys, and that's basically all the explanation they ever give you.
When it's light, you can't see into a place that's dark. But when it's dark, you can see what's around you much better.
No shit.
Along with this really cool update to the interrogation, where Sam can now introduce someone's face to every solid object in the near vicinity. Because, yeah, nothing gets someone talking faster than getting concussed. A lot of which are also unique to the encounter. Welcome to prime time, bitch.
Prime time, bitch.
Not to mention, totally the kind of thing you could see Batman doing in one of the Arkham games.
Tell me everything about the Riddler.
He even slaps around Grimm a bit early on in the game too.
Okay.
What's also interesting is this whole fluid cover system, where you can seamlessly move from cover to cover, which is a similar system that they'd use in Watch Dogs, along with also having some very similar looking executions. Which is really the main problem this one has though, considering going lethal is pretty much your only option. And almost every single takedown and gadget ends with someone's soul leaving their body. You've got explosive grenades, you've got explosive remote mines, explosive proximity mines, explosive sticky cameras, really just a lot of things exploding.
Whoa, holy shit. That shit don't fly with me, asshole! Nice try, asshole, but it ain't gonna work!
Yeah, plot twist, it in fact did work. And about the only non-lethal item is this portable EMP thing that Sam wears on his back. But even then, like, that thing just staggers enemies long enough for you to close the distance so you can kill them. And you've just got so many of these kind of items in your inventory that you can abuse the absolute piss out of them.
Enough of this Fisher crap.
The biggest thing they've added in, though, is this whole mark and execute mechanic, where after a single takedown, Sam can then target multiple enemies in the area and quickly take them all out one after the other. Where it soon becomes this very repetitive rhythm of just trying to get into the best position to take someone out, so you can then quickly execute everyone else nearby, with entire areas often feeling like they've been designed around this approach.
Oh, shit!
Which is then doubly funny considering that if you pull out a gun and just try to shoot someone normally, Sam's aim is still absolutely horrific, and the guy's still unable to hit the side of a barn. The main reason I think this sucks, though, is that because going lethal in stealth games really is about the most unrewarding way to play them. I mean, at least with me, for instance, like, the real satisfaction in these games comes from being able to either sneak up behind someone and knock them out, or get past them without even being seen to begin with. And I don't know, like, going up behind someone and shooting them in the back of the skull or snapping their neck just kind of feels like a bit of a bitch move, which is what Sam's doing throughout all of this. And yes, like, I know that you could also kill people in the other games, but at least you had the choice there to knock them out instead. And that's really what this thing lacks, is the choices you could have in the older games. You're just kind of forced into playing as Sam Wick throughout all of this, which is a fresh take on the character, but absolutely jarring in comparison to the previous game. I do want to say on a positive note, though, that I think this game has some of the all-time best enemy banter, like, ever.
The longer this takes, the more pissed off I get.
And the way that enemies are often going to comment on things and goad Sam is really believable and realistic.
Oh, shit! Oh.
Like, there's an early mission where you escape from an airfield and kill a bunch of soldiers on your way out, and then in a later mission you'll hear enemies remarking on that out loud, and on how they want to square things up with Sam as a result.
I had friends at the airfield, Fisher! You're gonna die in your shit!
And I don't know, like, it's just far more interesting than hearing someone repeating the same one or two lines over and over every time they hear a suspicious noise.
Is this how you want to go out? Cowering in a corner?
The worst thing about this game, though, is that it really is also super short, being like 5 or so hours in total, with a fair chunk of it also being dedicated to this dog shit flashback mission set in Iraq, where you're playing as one of Sam's old war buddies, Victor, which is just so incredibly boring and run-of-the-mill, feeling like something out of an entirely different game, and only existing to set up the relationship between Victor and Sam, as being old war buddies or whatever.
Thanks, Vic.
Yeah, well, don't thank me till we're out of here.
Which, you know, might have been good if we actually cared who this guy was. Which we don't, because we'd never even heard of him a single time in the games that came before this.
Shit. Sorry, Sam.
I think at the end of the day, if Conviction had been about any other character instead of Sam Fisher, it might have been more well received. But it is understandable why people were so pissed off when they first played this, especially coming off the back of stuff like Double Agent and Chaos Theory, which is still the apex of the series. To go from games like that where you had to monitor your light level, the noise you made, the stance you're in, not to mention rationing all of your equipment, to a game like this where you can top up your ammo and gadgets every 2 minutes and your visibility is broken down into a binary choice. You don't even get Sam's iconic goggles here, and in fact the only goggles you do get don't even work in that way, instead just letting you ping enemies through the walls. It is worth mentioning as well that Conviction had a really awesome co-op mode. We could play through a bunch of prequel missions with a buddy, which I remember being super difficult but also rewarding. But of course, Ubisoft fucked all of that up and functionality has been completely removed, with the only way to now play these missions being to do it solo. The icing on the cake for all of this is that the PC version of the game is absolutely busted, and simply getting this thing to run took a whole heap of buggering around. Overall though, I don't think Conviction is a bad game. In fact, it's a pretty good stealth action game. The problem is that Splinter Cell fans didn't want an action game. They wanted another Splinter Cell. And despite it selling pretty well, it's still widely and justifiably agreed upon to be the series' low point. I don't know, at least we still had Michael Ironside voicing Sam. But if you thought Conviction was bad in the way that it strayed from its roots, well, with Wolfenstein Youngblood, it's like those guys looked at what Ubisoft did and said, hold my beer.
Fuck yeah!
What the hell is even that?
So I don't think I really need to go over what Wolfenstein's all about, but to sum it up, it's a series that's primarily been about the exploits of old BJ Blazko, with all of the games having different interpretations of the character, but with the core theme always being about him going up against the Nazis during the Second World War, being something of a military-themed shooter, but then also adding in elements of science fiction and the paranormal. And despite what people might think about every entry, that's always been the formula that each developer's followed. Then we got Wolfenstein Youngblood, where he's more or less completely absent, and the focus is now on his two daughters, Jessie and Zofia, with the whole thing taking place after the new Colossus, where BJ's gone mysteriously missing, and the two girls end up having to go off to Europe and find him, which is then treated as if it's this kind of merry little adventure where the stakes are barely even acknowledged.
Oh my god, I got his brains in my mouth! Water, give me water!
But what it really did differently was how much it changed up the gameplay, turning the whole thing into a co-op focused shooter with all these main and side missions, along with this semi-open world structure where you could explore the city at your own pace and complete all these different objectives, along with giving enemies different levels and having giant health bars above their heads, making it all feel like some kind of low-grade RPG. One which you also more or less had to play with an actual partner, given how bad the bot AI was and how little assistance they'd actually give you, with some of the enemies being ridiculously spongy and the final boss being one of the worst designed bosses ever. Now to be fair, like in this game's defense, the series has never really stuck to one specific style. I mean, the original Wolfenstein 3D was more or less like a key hunting maze simulator. Return to Castle Wolfenstein was a more traditional boomer shooter with fast movement speed and these linear levels. Wolfenstein in 2009 was an open world game where you got these outright superpowers and could hop between dimensions in between obliterating the Nazis with stupidly overpowered abilities and weapons. And then the New Order, Old Blood and New Colossus were primarily narrative-focused games that tried to strike a balance between the older style of run-and-gun shooter with stuff like manual health, but then also incorporating more modern features like cover shooting. Plus, we're not even really considering the difference with Castle Wolfenstein, which came before all of this. I guess my point is that it's not all that wild for them to suddenly have decided to make a co-op shooter, given the series' schizophrenic nature up until that point. But that is really, I think, the reason why most people dislike this, simply because it got rid of BJ, and made these new characters the main focus, at a time when it really seemed like developers just didn't understand what their own fans wanted, and really seemed to bend the knee and make games catered for the kind of people who don't really play video games to begin with. The thing is though, despite all of this, the shooting and the movement controls are still pretty good. When you can run and slide around, gunning enemies down with dual machine guns, or just navigate the environments in those nifty power suits, it wasn't that bad. And I really didn't hate this thing as much as a lot of other people did. But still, I get it. It was definitely lacking something. And despite how I feel about it, I can't really deny that it more or less killed off the franchise, given that we haven't had any other Wolfenstein games since. They never actually officially released any kind of sales numbers either, but I think that alone should tell you that it probably didn't sell very well. Now, not every single sequel gets immediate backlash and torn apart, with some taking years to build up that kind of reputation, which is sort of the case with Bioshock Infinite. A game which definitely wasn't hated when it first launched. In fact, it actually sold very well, along with having a very positive critical and player response. It's just that it did have a very vocal negative minority, and throughout the years it seems that crowds only gotten bigger and bigger.
Wait, man, that card.
Released in 2013, it's the third main game in the series. A couple of games where you usually play as some poor asshole trapped deep under the ocean in a destroyed city, fighting junkies juiced up on sea slug jizz, and making highly difficult moral decisions as to whether or not you will or won't murder innocent children. Yeah, all jokes aside though, the first two games are pretty damn good, and something I end up replaying usually once or twice a year just for funsies. Which made me definitely one of those people who had a raging hard-on for Bioshock Infinite, which definitely took the series in a new direction. Because unlike the whole underwater dystopia thing with Rapture in Bioshock 1 and 2, Infinite instead takes you to this floating city in the sky named Columbia.
Hallelujah.
Playing as a Pinkerton agent named Booker T, trying to rescue a young girl named Elizabeth from the city's leader and so-called prophet Zachary Cumsock.
The Lord forgives everything, but I'm just a prophet, so I don't have to.
With Booker being hired to rescue Elizabeth to apparently wipe away some kind of debt, but right from the get-go, you get the impression that there's a whole lot more going on here, which turns out to be the understatement of the century.
What the...
And that's the game's real issue, and not that it lacked ambition, more in the sense that it had too much of it. At least in a story sense, with this really confusing plot device about how Elizabeth's able to open these dimensional tears through space and time, but none of it really coming together in any sort of cohesive way. Pretty common complaint you also heard people talking about early on there was how everything in the game looked bright and cartoonish, taking place in the middle of the day with this gorgeous backdrop that looked like something off a postcard, where it really felt like you were walking around some kind of an amusement park, with Booker able to ride on what's more or less roller coaster lines with the device he had on his arm, and Elizabeth looking more like a Disney princess than some kind of poor protected hostage that's been hidden away from the world for her entire life.
Oh, come dance with me, Mr. Twin.
I don't dance. Come on, let's go.
Why?
All of which is true, but I also think people who say that are blatantly overlooking the second half of the game, where you're moving through Columbia after the events that have completely overturned it, where it feels much more like the previous entries, as you really see the remnants and ruins of this once great and thriving society. This time it's just like you're getting a chance to see Rapture before the splicers attack and the whole place went tits up. Yeah, those goddamn splicers.
Goddamn splicers.
Along with Elizabeth having some really crucial and kinda dark plot moments that change her fundamentally as a character.
Whoa, hey, easy.
And she's definitely worth highlighting too as someone who not only went on to benefit 3D animation in unspeakable ways, but also caused irreparable damage to the willpower of an entire generation of young men. Yeah, if you know, you know.
I understood that reference.
In the game though, she's a really useful asset, able to lockpick doors and get you into side areas. She's able to summon in different objects during combat to help you out, and occasionally she'll chuck over some spare health or ammo.
Okay, catch.
Nice!
With the entire story centering around who she is, her backstory, and her ties to Booker's past.
I want to see Paris. I want to see everything.
Combat-wise, it does feel somewhat similar to the previous games, only now instead of plasmids, you've got the Vigors, these mass-produced drinks that give Booker all these kind of superpowers.
That's a hell of a thing.
Like Devil's Kiss, which is basically just an incendiary grenade. There's Murderer Crows, which is more or less insect swarm from the previous games. Yeah, not the bees.
Oh, no, not the bees! Not the bees!
Where a Shock Jockey is basically just Electro Bolt.
See what else I can find.
Bucking Bronco is a more unique addition, and this one's easily one of the best, causing multiple enemies to hover in the air for a few seconds, giving you free reign to finish them all off. And something like Charge and Return to Sender are super useful too, with Charge letting you turn yourself into a ballistic missile, and Return to Sender able to capture enemy projectiles and let you launch them back. Weirdly too, there is a surprising amount of depth here when it comes to the combat, especially when you start wearing all those different bits of gear, with there being 4 slots here for all this clothing which adds on various buffs and improvements. Like there's a hat which makes it so melee attacks can ignite enemies, and when you combine it with that upgraded charge vigor, which recharges your shield and also gives you invulnerability, well, you can start to see where you can become pretty damn powerful. And it's a system you outright have to abuse if you're ever going to beat that 1999 difficulty. Yeah, I did it. I was there.
I was there, Gandalf.
I kind of appreciate too how all the upgrades for these vigors are super expensive, so you can't just max out every single one of them and have to actually pick a few to focus on. It's just that they rarely seem to have any overarching user interaction with the environment, like being able to zap people in water, light up oil slicks, or even pick things up telekinetically and throw them around. But all you get there is the ability to control the odd gun turret with the possession vigor, with that whole hacking minigame also being completely done away with.
That's what you wanted?
Well, yeah, and speaking of things being stripped back, there's all the shooting, with Infinite removing mechanics like the alternate ammo types, and including a lot of weapons here, but a whole bunch of them that end up feeling redundant. The starting pistol, for instance, is something you'll probably never use once you find the machine gun, and although there is a pretty decent shotgun in there, it is objectively outclassed by the carbine rifle and the hand cannon. In fact, if they gave you that carbine earlier, you could beat the entire game, I'd say, using that alone. There's an RPG here which is useful against the tougher enemies, and this thing makes the volley gun completely useless. And the only times you ever really need to use a sniper rifle is when the game outright forces you to, when you're coming up against enemies armed with a sniper as well.
Wait a minute!
What?
The second half of the game is Booker and Elizabeth taking on the Vox Populi, who are these rebels who've taken over the city and started this whole civil war. And these guys carry weapons that are like bootlegged, modified version of the same guns that Comstock soldiers carry. Like a carbine rifle that's been modded to fire in bursts, which does sound neat, but it kind of isn't. And in almost every instance, these are just worse off version of the other guns. It's not helping things either how you've now got a 2-weapon limit, as opposed to that more traditional approach in the other games where you're able to stockpile every single weapon in existence. And then take into account how the vast majority of enemy forces is just people with guns, removing all the uniqueness to the different splicer types you'd fight in Bioshock 1 and 2. Yeah, goddamn splicers.
Goddamn splicers.
And while you would occasionally take on vigor-themed enemies with the firemen and the crowmen, these guys are far less common overall, and it's mostly just you trading shots with these hit-scanning enemies, where it becomes less about using different combinations of plasmids, setting up traps or utilising the environment, and more just about cheesing through the combat with the same 1 or 2 weapons, trying to kill everyone as quickly as possible before you get utterly melted. Considering there is some absolute bullshit with the AI in some of these arenas, especially on hard mode. Like, check this shit out, for instance, how this guy fired a rocket at me from the other side of the planet, and it somehow hit me while I was flying around on the skyline. Okay. Patriots and Handymen essentially replace the Big Daddies, and it seems that Irrational Games still don't know how to make these heavier enemies challenging without just giving them an absurd amount of hit points, and making them do insanely high damage to the player. Now, it's not too bad with the Patriots, simply because you can at least stun them and use cover to break line of sight. But the Handymen are far more mobile, leaping all over the place, with their main weakness being a giant weak spot on the middle of their chest. Which should be fine, only some fucking idiot thought it was a good idea to have the screen shake all over the place every time you're fighting one of them. Making it way harder to hit that weak spot than it really should be. It'd be like asking someone to write their name in calligraphy in the middle of an earthquake. It's also worth highlighting how you rarely get to initiate combat with enemies anymore. Like in the first couple of games, for instance, when you took on a Big Daddy, you always got to choose whether or not to engage them, giving you as much time as you wanted to plan out your attack and choose what kind of approach you'd take, by setting up traps or other hazards. And with the splicers, you'd often come across these guys walking around the city completely unaware of your presence. In Infinite, though, you're almost always ambushed by the enemies and can do little more than just go right on the defensive. And that's just how the general combat loop feels. You enter an area, a bunch of people spawn in, and you shoot them. Where it just feels more like a shooting gallery and less like a world populated with this believable hostile force. And that's probably what Infinite has going against it the most, because while none of this stuff is bad, it feels far worse off than Bioshock 1 and 2. Especially when it comes to any of those meaningful character selection moments either. I mean, all it's got here is choices that affect something cosmetic, like choosing what kind of necklace Elizabeth wears or whether or not you're gonna shoot first.
Stay where you are!
Move in!
What are you
doing?
And I know that Bioshock's moral choices were pretty black and white, in the sense of choosing whether you were going to kill an innocent child or not, but Bioshock 2 had some genuinely clever moments with some tough decisions the player had to make.
Your call, friend. Grace is unarmed, for what it's worth.
Infinite has none of that, which is kind of ironic for a game with a story all about alternate universes, timelines, and all that stuff.
Chin up. There's always next time.
I suppose there is.
And that's really the biggest criticism about Infinite overall, is that story, man, which really stops making any kind of sense. Right around the time that Elizabeth and Booker start opening those dimensional tears and royally messing up the whole space-time continuum. At one point, for instance, they need to get tools to make weapons and ammo for the Vox Populi, which they find locked up in a police station, where a glimpse into another tear reveals a reality where they're not there, which Booker and Elizabeth immediately assume means that in that world, the tools must automatically already be in the hands of the rebels.
Well, if the tools aren't in there,
Then they must be back
back at the shop.
What? And it's like there is a literal infinite amount of realities and possibilities as to where those tools could actually be. I mean, they could be waiting to be put in storage, they could have been destroyed, they might not even exist in that reality at all. But yet for some reason their instant assumption is that, oh, because they're not there, they must be with the rebels. Okay, with the whole game being full of a lot of these dumb, silly plot points, which start to make sense when you remember that Ken Levine admitted he's no expert when it comes to how quantum physics work, and really just included this stuff as a plot device because it seemed intelligent. And I still have no clue how the whole Booker, Comstock, and Slate plot is meant to work, so if anyone can explain that one to me, well, go ahead by all means.
Eat everything that's on your plate! Finish it!
I do want to say though that I don't think all of the negativity was justified with this one, and there's really been a lot of weird criticisms about the game. Like I do remember, for instance, seeing someone complaining how during that short sequence when you meet Elizabeth, that there's a hand railing during that stint when you're walking outside. You know, as if this entire narrative-focused sequence not having a fail state somehow made it bad, simply because this person thought they should have had the option to fall to their death. I also remember seeing countless people bring up how the Skyhook in reality should really be ripping Booker's arm off, given the force and speed he'd grab onto certain rails. Which again, I've always thought is such a dumb criticism, given we're playing a game set on a floating city where we're shooting crows at people. And again, overall, I don't think that this one was a bad game, but it's just that instead of stepping forwards, it's really like it chose to step sideways. Not really improving or evolving anything they'd done prior, and really just being so different too from all that footage they showed us pre-launch, which no amount of damage control in those short DLC stories could possibly fix. Either way, though, it didn't really seem to matter, because this is still the highest-selling game in the franchise. And love it or hate it, it did get objectively critically acclaimed, even if that fan backlash is something that's continued to get more frequent throughout the years. Despite being able to debate, though, whether or not Infinite was deserving of that scrutiny, one thing I don't think anyone's going to argue is the final game in the video, with Dead Space 3.
Oh, shit.
Yeah, The Godfather Part 3, Spider-Man 3, or Blade Trinity of video game trilogies, widely agreed upon to be the worst game in the series, and also the one that more or less killed it off.
This is going to work, right?
Developed again by Visceral Games, it takes place after the events of Dead Space 2, putting us back into the stomping boots of Isaac Clarke, who's gone into hiding after the events of the second game, only to get back in the fray when the location of the original marker is discovered, with it finally seeming like there's a way to stop things for good, with Isaac begrudgingly dusting off the old plasma cutter for one last hurrah, having to deal with some familiar foes and even friends. Like returning character Ellie, for instance, who's moved on and started dating someone else, while Isaac was off look-maxing whilst in hiding. And at first, things don't seem that bad, with a pretty cool prologue sequence on this icy planet with some impressive scripted sequences. But soon after we're in control of Isaac is where it all goes to shit. With these early shootouts against human enemies, which is not only a first for the series, but also just about the most generic combat ever. Totally removing that whole limb-cutting mechanic that the series is known for, where it just stopped feeling like Dead Space and started to feel like any other generic action shooter you'd play in 2013. Along with that, the other thing this has going against it is how it really is blatantly designed to be played as a co-op game first and foremost, with new character John Carver appearing in that opening cinematic and then quickly working alongside Isaac from that point on. And while you can play this solo if you really want to, it's just not being balanced or scaled for that approach, with the enemy count still staying the same regardless of whether or not you're playing with a second person. And there's a lot of areas in the game where enemies just come out of every possible wall or crevice without any kind of flow or purpose. With lots of moments where if you're playing solo, you end up getting attacked from behind because you really couldn't have seen it coming. Stuff that feels manageable if you're being assisted by another person. And it quickly just becomes lame and tedious, making combat feel like a slog, as you take out the 50th bunch of necromorphs all by yourself, where you don't even really consider trying to cut off limbs or any of that stuff, simply because you are so inundated with things trying to kill you that the only real way to survive is to just spam your weapons constantly, abusing stasis as much as possible. All problems that don't really happen when you got a second person to share the load with. In fact, there's even side areas you can't access unless you're playing with someone else. Oh god. When it comes to the puzzles, when you're with a partner, a lot of the time one person's going to have to solve it while the other one defends them from incoming attacks. And it adds a sense of urgency to these short moments, making it really fraught with suspense as you're doing your best before you both get overwhelmed. If you're playing solo though, none of this applies and you can usually just take as long as you want, with pretty much no danger. Dead Space 3 also introduced a new feature where you can craft all these stupidly overpowered weapons using resources you find throughout the levels, with there being some really broken combinations there. The thing is though, you don't even really need to do that, simply because the basic plasma cutter with a few upgrades is still really effective even late game. And also considering that they seriously dumbed down the ammunition, to the point that you've now just got this generic clip that works for every single weapon, giving you even less of a reason to bust out anything else. Really removing all of the resource management for those bigger and better guns, simply because ammo is just totally universal. The worst thing about it though is that when this first came out, they had this whole microtransaction system going on.
You got the epic weapon and resource pack for $3, bot. There's a bunch of bot ones like capacity upgrade, bot personality pack. For $5, like, this is nuts.
Where you could spend real money to buy resources in-game to craft all these weapons, completely taking away the progression of doing this yourself, where you could potentially just craft this stuff at any point and steamroll through everything the game threw at you.
It's absolutely crazy.
Now to be fair, like I said, you never needed to actually do this, and you've also got these little scavenger bot things you can place around to passively find resources and dump them at the next workbench. But just the sheer inclusion of a system like this really showed you how far the series had strayed from its survival horror roots, into this sort of generic boring action shooter that felt plagued by corporate intervening and bizarre creative decisions. And speaking of creative decisions, like, what happened to all the memorable set pieces and encounters? Stuff like taking on the stalkers or seeing Isaac poke his eyes out with a giant syringe. Even Ellie looked like an entirely different person, with this whole weird love triangle side plot going on between her and Isaac, and then this super insecure douchebag who seems more concerned by getting his girlfriend cucked away than this overarching threat of the necromorphs.
But I'm gonna leave you this trail of flesh.
If the man's dead, Ellie, let's go.
I really hate that man.
On a positive note though, I do think that this new frozen planet you visit, Tower of Atlantis, not to be confused with Kazonde, is visually at least pretty interesting. Also feeling like it's getting in touch with the series' whole John Carpenter influences. Plus it also introduced a really neat mechanic where your suit gets compromised and you have to stay near heat sources so you don't freeze to death. And then shortly after that, you come across this abandoned base overrun with these emaciated necromorphs that only react to light sources. But even these ideas, which are neat, are just then very quickly done away with. Because after a short while on the planet, you get this brand spanking new suit and don't have to worry about the cold from that point on. And you're actually better off attacking those enemies as opposed to avoiding them. Because for one reason, they're super easy to kill, and they drop so many resources, it's like they're undead piñatas. And then outside of that, regardless of where you actually are moment to moment, it's still mostly just about shooting dozens of necromorphs over and over, as you go around powering up machinery and playing the role of a handyman. And I don't know, like, I think on some level as well, this was just the problem that a lot of games had back then when they were the third entry in a much-loved series. I mean, look at stuff like Killzone 3, Resistance 3, and even Uncharted 3. It's not like any of these are bad games at any stretch, but it is just a bit of a natural progression by that point in the series. That there's only so many times you can do the same thing over and over until it starts to get a bit boring. Especially when that second game was so highly acclaimed. I mean, don't forget, right, like this thing had to follow Dead Space 2, which is easily one of the all-time best sequels ever made. The same way The Godfather Part 3 followed The Godfather Part 2, Spider-Man 3 followed Spider-Man 2, and Hades 3 followed Hades 2. And I guess on some level there is novelty to be had here playing through the co-op mode with a mate, which does result in some pretty funny moments.
I'm trying to go up, it's not letting me go up. It's because you're blocking the fucking thing. It won't move, you gotta move.
What are you doing? But it's hard to deny that the series' identity by this point was stretched pretty thin.
Is the man dead, Ellie? Let's go!
Like I said at the start of the video, I don't think any of these are like objectively bad games. It's just that sometimes simply following up on what people loved beforehand and simply being good just doesn't always cut it. And sometimes the biggest mistake a sequel can make is forgetting or not identifying why people cared about it in the first place. Either way though, that about brings us to the end of the video. If you can think of any other crappy sequels I forgot to mention, well, be sure to bring it up in the comments below. And also, if you've stuck around this long and haven't already, maybe consider hitting that sub button and supporting the channel. As always though, thanks for watching.